Thank you so much, Clarice, and thank you to the team at Stage for inviting me and making this possible. I think my screen should now be visible, and let me know.
Yes, it's working.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining to all of you and for your patience in letting me speak English. I have a habit of speaking very fast, but I'm going to try to slow down a bit today. And trust me, this is way better than listening to me speak French. A theatrical performance takes place in a particular place. And in theater and performance studies, contemporary fascination with what we call site-specific performances sometimes elides the simple fact that all theaters are unique physical spaces with particular physical qualities. Site-specific, in our typical usage, refers to a performance developed for a non-traditional theatrical space, a churchyard, a hotel, and thus calls particular attention to the interplay among performance, space, and place. And scholars such as Mike Pearson, Anna Birch, and Joanne Tompkins have written wonderfully on this valuable descriptive category. But our excitement about this mostly contemporary flavor of site specificity has disguised what we might call a general site specificity for all theater. In other words, site specificity is a matter of degree and not of kind. All theatrical performances are specific to their sites, in the sense that they adapt to fit the specific stage and backstage and audience space. Fascination with contemporary site-specific performance at the expense of recognizing performance's normal site specificity exemplifies to me a particular way of thinking about culture that valorizes the unique and the surprising and ignores the complexity of simple, normal practices. Yet these norms, rather than the exceptions, should define how we think about theater history. Why? Three broad reasons. First, focusing on norms emphasizes the constraints within which theater is produced. And those constraints, what we might call the conditions of theater making and theater going, are as much a part of the meaning of theater as the content of any production. Theater architecture is one such constraint. It shapes the possible meanings of a theatrical event. Spending $200 for a Broadway ticket is part of the meaning of every Broadway show. And that price isn't an isolated fact. It's part of a system of regulations and expectations. And ticket prices are determined by many factors, including tax laws, ticket distribution systems, production costs, and more. Similarly, if a high school stages a musical and uses the choreography from the original production, then that's part of the meaning of that musical. And copyright, play publishing practices, and marketing all play a role in how high schools select and stage their productions. The theatrical system, law, economics too, they determine those conditions and set those norms. Second reason to focus on norms. Most theater making and most theater going is not exceptional, but normal. Most theatrical productions fail economically and artistically, though perhaps not socially for the community of artists and audience. Every career, even the most exceptional, has its banalities and its embarrassments. And go ahead and pick your favorite screen performer and think of all the absolute duds they've been in their careers. Rare, too, is the modern actor who does not work or wish to work in advertising. I love the thing where like male actors it gets decided that they're hot and all of a sudden they're in watch advertisements. That's like the thing that happens to them. If we ignore these aspects of theatrical art, we declare most theatrical activity irrelevant to understanding theater, and that doesn't seem right. Third reason, even if we want to focus on exceptions, stylistically groundbreaking or outstandingly successful shows or individuals, we cannot understand an exception except in comparison to the norm. Difference always begs the question, how different and from what? Theater history needs to understand what was normal about how theater was made and viewed in order to grasp what was new about theatrical innovations. And this somewhat banal statement implies actually a major research project to which Clarice alluded. There's a lot to do to understand normal theater history. So how to understand such norms? Well, methodologically, many approaches are necessary to writing a normal history of theater, including approaches and knowledge from other historical subfields. For instance, legal history offers tools for interpreting new copyright laws for performance in the 19th century. Transportation history explains how the development of railroads made possible new theatrical touring cultures. And among the most vital methods for understanding theater's normal operations, its everyday practices, is data-driven analysis. Quantitative methods give us an ability to see theater at scale, rather than in specific, merely local and time-bound expressions. So this talk is going to demonstrate the use of data to explore US theater operations at the turn of the 20th century. And I'm going to delve into the possibilities of these studies and emphasize the questions that they let us explore a little better, as well as the limitations of these studies and the opportunities afforded by executing them with varying amounts of precision. Modern computer-driven analytic methods take us beyond the possibilities of quantitative studies in previous generations, but far from automating historical work, they encourage increasingly subtle and precise historical thinking. So to demonstrate the possibilities and the limitations of these methods for theater history, I want to focus on a wonderful category of theatrical ephemera that was about theatrical site specificity: theatrical directories, catalogs, and guides. And I've realized I have a whole shelf of them over there, and I didn't pick a prop, so I'm going to have to get a prop after I'm done with this talk proper. I'll show you my prop. So theater directories, catalogs, and guides. After the Civil War, a few theatrical entrepreneurs began publishing directories of the American theater. And these volumes are pitched to professionals, particularly to theatrical managers, and they provide them with the information necessary to tour theatrical productions around the country. Sweet's Amusement Directory and Traveler's Guide of 1870 is one of the earliest entries in this genre. It promised to provide for every principal town and city reliable information of theaters, opera houses, halls, hotels, printing offices, bill posters, transfer expresses, etc., etc. Compilers of these guides, usually themselves bookers or managers for the entertainment industry, promised the most up-to-date and reliable information, including details about what resources a theater offered, what managers could expect to earn given the venue's ticket prices, how to travel to and from the city or town, and what companies should anticipate spending in advertising and housing costs. And these details, with more or less specificity, form the core information from these directories. But the format and the content of these volumes, which appeared into the 1920s, and there are scattered versions even later, varied depending on the publisher and on the period. So Sweet's entries are often rather discursive and relatively imprecise. Harry Miner's American Dramatic Directory from 1884 included lists of combination companies touring that season, a retrospective list of Miner's own company's tours in recent seasons, and a professional directory of managers, authors, music directors, and performers. The dense entries name both the performer's line of business and a means of contacting them. For example, Sloan, William H., low comedy and singing parts, dramatic agent Simons and Brown, for the address of 2352 Thompson Street, Philadelphia. The Donaldson Guide of 1884 included a similar register of professionals, along with a specially constructed 50-page cipher to facilitate sending telegrams about theatrical business more cheaply and efficiently. Some of these guides appeared in multiple editions for over a decade. Jeffrey's Guide and Directory ran at least 11 editions, and others for only a year or two. None had a longer lifespan than those produced by Julius Kahn. So Kahn spent most of his career as a booking agent for the theatrical impresario Charles Frohman. In 18 volumes between 1896 and 1921, Kahn, sometimes in collaboration with others, published a guide to theaters around the United States. A typical page in Kahn's guides looked like this. So here we see the end of the listings for Florida and the beginning of the listings for Georgia. Entries are sorted by town: Abbeville, Albany, Americus, Athens. Entries are sorted by town, though major cities come at the front of the book in order of importance. So the entry for Albany, Georgia, Kahn notes first the population, and then in the paragraphs after the theater description here, newspapers, hotels and their rates, railroads and railroad agents, the local transfer company, which transported theatrical goods to and from the station and the theater, and sometimes local program publishers, as in the listing for Americus here. You can see the publisher of program is J.A. Skelton. The theater descriptions themselves vary in the level of detail. For Albany's Rawlins Theater, we get the names of managers and scenic artists, along with audience capacity, ticket price range, method of lighting and heating, detailed stage dimensions, including trap doors, and the minimum requirements for printed advertising. Glover's Opera House in Americus includes similar dimensions, along with the names of the orchestra leader and stage carpenter, but in Abbeville, W.A. Little, the manager of the principal theater, provided Kahn with no details. Now, all of this information answered practical questions for managers and booking agents. Is the stage too small for my production? Which railroad can get me to the theater? To which transfer agent should I address my correspondence? Are there local musicians who work with the theater, or do I need to bring my own? For managers and booking agents, these guides made theater's site specificity possible by explaining the constraints of theatrical spaces across the country. And for historians, these guides provide a record of the changing form and operation of the American theater of the period. So, processing this information is a daunting task. The scanning projects by Google Books and its partners have produced downloadable PDFs of all of the Kahn guides, along with machine-generated plain text versions of the guides using optical character recognition. So these plain text versions of this guide suffer from all the problems typical of these methods, compounded by formatting differences within each volume and changes across the volumes. So barring a massive transcription project or a leap forward in machine-driven information processing from texts of this kind, which we might be close to, a historian has to balance the desire for a complete and accurate record against the time and effort required to produce such a record. So for some kinds of information, though, acceptable results are still feasible even by working with these texts using regular expressions. For those of you who don't know, regular expressions are essentially a really, really powerful find and replace function available to you as a programmer. They can account for variations in how information is presented by treating a search as a set of logical possibilities. So Kahn's guide sometimes indicates a theater's seating capacity as SC or S capital C, or seating capacity or S cap, or about 5 other things you can find. Regular expressions allow a user to get all of those results at once. Additionally, basic data cleaning that fixes persistent errors, such as 5 2 lowercase o's as a transcription for 500, allows for further refinement of a search. Now, is the resulting information pulled from each guide a precise representation of the information contained therein? No. Does it accurately capture certain aspects of that information? Yes, in some domains. So what then can we learn from Kahn's guides, given the technical challenges constraining our ability to work with them at scale? Using regular expressions to search for seating capacity through all of Kahn's guides from Volume 1, 1896, to Volume 15, 1910, we get some quick information about the American theater of 15 years. A few things we might observe immediately. First, the number of theaters, N, increases from 1,502 to 2,743 in 1910. Now, there are some blips in 1902 to 1905. Those might be artifacts of our quick and dirty analysis, or they might be real differences in the guides. But the steady growth overall reflects both an expansion of Cahn's listings and a real growth in the number of theaters across the country. And I'll say a little more about this in just a moment. Consider then the seating capacities themselves. The distribution of seating capacities over these 15 years is remarkably stable. So despite an 83% increase in the number of theaters listed, the median capacity, as well as the lower and upper quartiles, are nearly identical for 15 years. Even the average capacity was relatively consistent between 943 and 990 seats. The US theater thus increased its capacity almost solely by building more venues within established theater sizes rather than moving towards larger venues. The 83% increase in the number of theaters nearly exactly matches an 83% increase in the total number of seats in all theaters. Notably, the growth in capacity here actually exceeds the US population growth in the period. In 1896, there were about 2 seats for every 100 people in the United States. By 1910, there were 2.9 seats per 100 people. Now, even leaving aside concerns about errors in extracting the data, Cahn's own records are far from perfect. It would be possible for the growth in the number of venues to represent not a true growth in the number of theaters, but just an expansion of Cahn's listings. However, by spot checking a few cities and towns, we can confirm that there really are new venues appearing. Indianapolis, Indiana, for instance, has 4 listings in 1896 and 7 in 1910. And those 3 new theaters are verifiable independently as new additions to the theatrical scene. Interestingly, Cahn's numbers still likely represent an undercount of theaters in the United States. Many sources, including recent scholars, cite critic William Winter, who estimated in 1913 that there were 5,000 theaters in 3,500 cities or towns as early as 1880, and 8,000 theaters in 6,000 cities or towns by 1912. So here's Cahn's numbers in 1910 from his guide, and here's Winter's estimate in 1912. So the question of precisely how many theaters existed in the US during these decades remains an open and challenging one, but a question for which these guides can help us begin to formulate a more sophisticated and detailed answer. So when we actually start counting and comparing guides, including Cahn's, the tallies vary widely. Jeffrey's guide from 1889 claims to provide listings for 5,659 theaters, opera houses, and halls in 3,773 cities or towns. And if we do the same thing with seating capacity that we did to Cahn's guides to Jeffrey's guide, we get 4,286 venues with a listed seating capacity, a mean of 684 seats, and a total of 2.8 million seats in the country. Donaldson's guide of 1894 doesn't advertise the number of venues listed, but again, if we do the same kind of analysis, we get 3,606 venues with a mean seating capacity of 529 and a total of 1.9 million seats in 1894. So both of those two guides, even a few years prior to Cahn's first edition, suggest a far larger number of venues than Cahn himself includes. So why are Cahn's numbers so much lower than Jeffrey's or Donaldson's? Well, Cahn advertises information of the leading theaters in his subtitle. And although a brief editorial introduction implies that his guide is comprehensive, he seems indeed to ignore many lesser venues. For instance, if we compare Cahn's guide with a contemporary region-specific competitor, we find major differences. In 1913, Cahn lists 92 playing points, that is, cities that have theaters, with 126 venues in California. Henry's official Western Theatrical Guide of 1907 gives 129 playing points with 211 venues in the state. So Kahn, though publishing 6 years after Henry, undercounts playing points and venues in California by 40%. Excuse me a second. Now, such a sizable deficit is probably not universal. Kahn's numbers in New York City are probably pretty excellent. And Henry also seems to offer a more capacious definition of a theater than Kahn does, the former including a small lumber camp, for instance, among his listings. A full accounting of theater in the United States, though, has to reckon with the sheer variety of theatrical venues, which each guide represents only to the extent that the variety serves the target audience for the guide. Still, William Winter's estimate of 8,000 theaters in 1913 outpaces Kahn's 2,700 by a factor of almost 3. And many of Kahn's towns are far from major metropolises. Does Kahn really list only a third of theaters in the United States? One more lacuna in Kahn's guides might help explain another problem in his accounting. If we think about theater in the United States in the late 19th century, with a more state-based, excuse me, choking on some piece of dust here, or even regional specificity, then we have to think about racial segregation in our analysis. So Kahn's guides include information about theaters serving primarily Black patrons only in its 1922 supplement to the final volume. And here's the first page of that listing. The white population is implicitly the denominator for theatrical capacity in all other guides by Kahn and others. And this fact matters particularly in states with large Black populations, such as Georgia. So in Kahn's 1920 volume, Georgia has 55 theaters for a population of 2.9 million. Indiana, with a similar population size, has 105 theaters. But Indiana has a Black population of only about 80,000. Georgia's Black population was 1.2 million. So Georgia did not have half as many theaters per capita as Indiana, but a comparable number of venues per capita for the white population of Georgia. So accounting for these kind of details with greater precision, we need not just this data from these rough methods, but a detailed and patient accounting of each specific entry across Kahn's guides and in consultation with other sources. But even bearing the shortcomings of these methods in mind, by using them, we can still begin to reckon better theater's expansion in the US in the late 19th and early 20th century. So in addition to numerical data, Kahn's guides provide us with detailed geographic information about theater in the United States, and we can use that information to better understand the operation and the limitations of one of the most important business organizations in late 19th century US entertainment, the Theatrical Syndicate. So the Syndicate sought to nationalize local theatrical touring circuits, which had begun appearing after the Civil War. Theatrical touring was a logistically complex business. If you have a badly arranged touring schedule, you're going to end up with your theater company hopping randomly across wide geographic areas, crossing through a town, only to backtrack and perform in that town later, stumbling from one night stand to one night stand to one night stand. Theater owners, meanwhile, confronted other kinds of inefficiency, and you could leave themselves either with a duplicate booking or with an empty house. So proto-circuits start to solve these problems for theater owners and managers alike. Theater historian Monroe Lipman explains, quote, "Local managers in contiguous territories began to combine for booking purposes. Small groups of theater managers in towns along the same railroad line got together and agreed on terms they would offer to traveling companies. The result was beneficial both to the managers and to the combination companies. The managers got better attractions at better terms at considerably less trouble and expense. The companies were also saved trouble, time, and money, for they were now able to book for several weeks at a time with a group of theater owners instead of having to deal separately with each of them. End of quote. So the next phase, which are the true circuits, bring these ad hoc associations together under the leadership of one single theater, usually the most powerful theater in the region, which takes a controlling interest in its surrounding neighbors. So by the late 1880s, power had moved into the hands of those theaters and then into a small number of booking agencies themselves, which handled the scheduling for the companies and theaters, while often also producing shows. So the final step leading to the syndicate occurs when a group of those agencies agree to book into their theaters, of which they owned or controlled the best, only attractions that book with those agencies. And they insisted that theaters that booked their attractions book only their attractions. In other words, it was a monopoly. How thorough was the monopoly? And how did it compare to the vast theater system described by Kahn's guides? So in 1910, that's Kahn's volume of that year, the syndicate directly owned 126 theaters, indicated in this image by squares, which are sized according to the number of theaters owned in each location. So they own more theaters in New York and Philadelphia than they do in Boston, where they still own a large number of theaters. The syndicate's operation is certainly impressive, but this number of theaters pales next to the size of the American theater, even to the incomplete portion of it in Kahn's guides. That same year in 1910, the guide listed around 2,700 venues, 21 times the size of the syndicate. So this image shows all the syndicate's theaters, but also all of the playing points, that is, towns or cities with theaters, not owned by the syndicate within the same territory that the syndicate covered. And of course, the syndicate also doesn't own every theater in New York or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. So why was the syndicate so powerful if they didn't have control over all of these places? Was the control of major urban centers that influential, even in the 1890s and 1910s? So yes, their chokeholds on New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Chicago, they matter. But their national influence depended not only on the theaters they owned, but also on other theaters that they booked but didn't own. And this included a group of 252 smaller theaters in New England, controlled by none other than Julius Kahn, who scheduled performances in this circuit through Claw and Erlanger's booking office, and as Frohman's booker, worked directly for the syndicate. So when we put Kahn's theaters alongside the syndicate, as listed in an advertisement from his guides, we can see how control of theatrical booking alongside theatrical venues made the syndicate such a powerful force in the theater. There are theaters that Kahn controls. Kahn and the syndicate combined controlled 378 theaters. They booked not 4% of the Kahn Guide's 2,700 theaters, but 14%, a much more significant proportion. And Monroe Lipman suggests that the syndicate's total reach, its ownership and booking control, seems to have extended to at least 500 theaters at one time or another. So the syndicate's power lay in the combination of their direct ownership, these gray squares, and their booking control, the black triangles. So in that same year, 1910, Julius Kahn actually quit the syndicate. He defected. And he permitted an open-door booking policy in his theaters, which effectively put the theaters in the hands of the syndicate's growing rival, the Schubert brothers. Responding to the move, Claw and Erlanger, major leaders of the syndicate, sneered to the New York Times, and they said, "In looking over the map of the United States, it seems to us that we will be able to struggle along without one-night stands such as Lewiston, Maine, and Fall River, Massachusetts." But of course, the ability to book one-night stands in a logical sequence for travel through a region was what made theatrical touring financially viable. And it was the whole point of the Cannes guides, too. Losing control over those venues severely constrained the syndicate's reach. And when the Schubert brothers finally broke the syndicate's control over the next few years, they did so not by controlling more of the big first-class theaters than their rivals, but by nearly doubling the syndicate's portfolio of smaller houses. 500 for the syndicate, 1,000 for the Schuberts. So in all of this preceding discussion about the number of theaters, about the seating capacity, about ownership and bookings, a key recurrent theme might be stated thus. Who or what kind of production is this theater for? A spectacle with a big star needed and could fill a large venue in a major city, likely owned or run by the Schubert Syndicate. A modest workaday touring company might depend more on Cannes' New England theaters and would have lost money trying to fill a larger venue. But in addition to these strategic and market-oriented questions about venue, there are also practical issues: the size of the stage, the presence of an orchestra, and in the changing technological environment of the turn of the century, the theater's means of illumination. Specifically, I'm talking about the theater's adoption of electricity. So details about theater's electrification remain relatively scarce. Gas was the predominant source of light in professional theaters through the later 19th century. Adopting electricity enabled a major aesthetic revolution, but it required first a technological and an industrial transformation. As Mary C. Henderson explains, quote, "Significant progress in manipulating light on stage did not arrive until electrification itself became more widespread. And electric illumination evolved slowly until power for it could be brought to the buildings through wires suspended in the streets instead of individual on-site generators. In 1885, Thomas Alva Edison supervised the installation of a complete system of electric lighting in Steele MacKay's Lyceum Theater in New York. Even after its demonstrated success, many theaters throughout the country continued to be built to include dual systems of gas and electric lighting. We can see this process of electrification borne out in Cannes' guides. When Cannes first started printing his guide, about 70% of his listed theaters offered electricity as one source of illumination. So that's this first bar, the first two shades. But about half of those theaters also used gas. This is gas and electricity here. Another 20% used only gas, this darker shade here. So by 1910, though, about 2/3 of theaters were only electric, that's the lightest here, and gas-only theaters hold a minuscule market share. Some of that change is due to the shrinkage in the gas market through the transformation or the closure of gas theaters, but much of it is attributable to new, or per the discussion above, newly documented theaters. So here's a count rather than a percentage. Two observations about this image. First, we can compare the total number of theaters about which we have the lighting method information to the number of venues with seating capacity information from the table I showed earlier. And we can see that there's always less information about illumination methods than there is about seating capacity. It's also perhaps just less easy to parse it with the OCR guides. In other words, our data set's not that reliable, but there's no reason to suspect that our using regular expressions on optical character recognition introduces a bias for or against electricity. And insofar as the guides themselves don't indicate sources of lighting, we might guess that a theater that doesn't tell you how it's lit is actually less likely to be electrified. The theaters with the least information listed tend to be those in smaller municipalities with smaller populations and fewer resources, where we are less likely to find electricity. Second, the number of actual theaters listing only gas shrinks from a peak of 201 in 1897 to 74 in 1910. Meanwhile, the number of electrified theaters increases from 656, 352 of them gas and electric, 304 electric only, to 1,717, 464 using gas or electric, 1,253 electrified theaters. Thus, as Kahn included information about more theaters, many of them presumably new, or at least rebuilt, those theaters are turning to electricity. And in 1896, it might still have been possible to rely only on gas and to tour theatrically in the United States. By 1910, a tour with gas only would have been significantly more challenging, if not impossible. What more can we say about electrification? Well, with a more granular and patient data analysis, we might actually map the geographical expansion of electricity in the theater. We could also identify specific theaters that convert from one form to another. One might even attempt to trace changes in touring routes as companies that rely on electric lighting follow the new technology. Now, unfortunately, even Kahn's guides cannot reveal the technical details of this transformation. And as other scholars of the period have noted, the details matter greatly. Early electric lighting treated incandescent bulbs just like old gas lamps, as static general dispersers of light. Ulf Otto explains that, quote, what electric stage equipment was striving for well into the 1920s was nothing other than to imitate as closely as possible the existing equipment with gas light that had prevailed since the 1840s. Incandescent bulbs replace gas burners, cables are laid in place of or right inside old pipes, resistors are installed in place of valves, but neither optics nor positions of lighting fixtures change significantly. End of quote. It took experiments by theatrical artists, such as David Belasco and later Joe Mielzner, and the innovations of European artists, such as Adolph Appia and Edward Gordon Craig, to discover the multiple uses to which these new tools could be put, and to develop lighting as its own finely controlled, expressive medium for the stage. So as new lighting techniques developed and standardized, production started to require even more specificity about each theater's technical affordances. Kahn's guides generally do not distinguish between theaters that supply electricity and those that supply electricity in particular ways that make certain lighting effects possible. But by 1913, they do frequently specify whether the electrical current is direct or alternating, along with the voltage, and some theaters name the number of stage pockets for lights, along with the existence of an electrical connection in the auditorium, usually in the balcony. For example, here we can see, and it starts here on this third line, illumination, electric, 110 alternating current, 5 stage pockets, front connection in balcony. Now, none of this information, though, is as detailed as a modern theatrical guide's information. Compare this image from Stage Specs of 1999. This is a volume that's produced by the Broadway League to support touring commercial productions in the modern world. They stopped printing it, it's now online. So here we find detailed technical information about materials for mounting lights, some specific venue-owned lighting equipment, most of it's provided by the production, and much, much more. Transformations in theatrical infrastructure depend on these details. Electrification is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Theatrical lighting, with its modern, increasingly complex methods and effects, demands increasingly precise technical capacities, or the ability, time, and resources to adapt a venue to those capacities. For instance, when A Chorus Line became the first Broadway show to use a computerized lighting board rather than a manually operated piano board, the theater had to be completely rewired. While Kahn's guides trace U.S. theater's electrification in the early 20th century, they do not tell us when and how lighting became the essential, subtle theatrical medium it is today. So these three uses of Kahn's guides only scratch the surface of the kind of historical studies they make possible. Some of the information contained in them, it's not new. Studies already exist, including some quantitative of the syndicate or of the number of theaters in the United States. But there's so much more to uncover. For instance, the national touring culture outlined in these guides depended on a growing transportation network, particularly railroads. And in addition to numerous maps advertising major rail lines, Kahn's guides list the major railroads that service each named town, freight rates between large hubs, as well as railroad employees who specialized in theatrical business. How did this railroad infrastructure, support certain patterns of theatrical movement, encourage theatrical cultures along particular paths determined by the rail system? Applying digital methods to Kahn's guides makes possible explorations of these new questions, as well as greater subtlety in our analysis of old questions, more precision, and a better understanding of what it even means to ask how many theaters existed in the United States around 1900. Simply by working at the scale encouraged by data such as that found in Kahn's guides, we turn our gaze from the individual theatrical work or organization to theatrical activity as such. Every theatrical production in the US around the turn of the 20th century took place in a specific theater or theaters. Those theaters came with physical constraints and possibilities, each of which could be either within contemporary norms or outside them. The meaning of a popular straight from New York production on a small stage in rural Iowa with electric lights is different from the meaning of the same production in a large house in Cleveland with gas lamps. But we can't begin to parse those meanings or how particular productions with their own technical requirements embrace or challenge them without knowing what's normal about theatrical practice, in this case, about the theaters themselves. Now, theater history is certainly not only normal. We can and we should continue to investigate the careers and performances of stars such as David Belasco or Charlotte Cushman or Ira Aldridge, but understanding norms gives us both a broader view of theatrical practice for its own sake and a better understanding of what specifically made certain theatrical lives or productions so exceptional. Paradoxically, to best understand this specific theater, we should work better to understand every theater. Thank you.